Ethan Carter had built his life around images because real life had always felt harder to read than photographs. In his small studio in Portland, Oregon, he spent long days helping families freeze their happiest moments while quietly noticing the emotions they never said out loud. He could see when a couple was falling apart even while smiling for the camera, and he often wondered if people ever saw him the same way. His marriage to Olivia Carter had once felt warm and full of promise, but over the last year it had turned into something distant and cold, with conversations that ended too quickly and silence that lasted too long. He told himself it was stress, work, or timing, but deep inside he felt something slipping away that he could not hold on to no matter how carefully he tried. That afternoon started like any other until the door of his studio opened and his mother-in-law Claire Bennett stepped inside without her usual warning call. Ethan froze for a moment because Claire rarely visited alone, and even more rarely without purpose. She was a composed woman in her late 50s with a calm presence that always made a room feel more controlled just by her being in it. She looked around the studio slowly as if she had entered a place she had never truly seen before, and Ethan immediately felt a strange tension he could not explain. She greeted him politely, but her voice carried a softness he was not used to hearing from her, and she said she had been nearby and thought she would stop in for a moment. Ethan tried to smile and act normal as he invited her to sit, but his instincts as a photographer told him something was off because people never arrived without emotion even when they claimed it was casual. Claire looked at the walls filled with portraits and her eyes lingered longer than usual on each image, as if she was searching for something hidden inside them. Ethan offered her coffee and tried to make light conversation, but she seemed distracted, almost distant, in a way that felt different from her usual controlled personality. Then without warning she placed an old photograph on his desk, and the energy in the room changed instantly as Ethan saw the faded image of a younger Claire standing beside a man he did not recognize. The photo looked old and worn, and on its back were handwritten words that made Ethan uneasy before he even fully read them. Claire watched him carefully as if measuring his reaction, and for a moment neither of them spoke because something heavy had entered the space between them. Ethan finally asked what it meant, and Claire hesitated as though the answer carried weight she had carried for years. She told him that she needed to talk about Olivia, and those words immediately tightened something in his chest because he had been avoiding that topic in his mind for too long. Claire's voice lowered as she explained that Olivia had not been honest for quite some time and that the truth was more complicated than Ethan believed. Ethan felt a mix of confusion and defensiveness rising inside him because he did not want to hear anything that would make the last year of his marriage feel even more uncertain. But Claire continued anyway, saying that Olivia had been emotionally distant long before Ethan noticed, and that there were parts of her life he was never included in. Ethan sat down slowly, trying to process the words, but his thoughts kept jumping between denial and fear because deep down he already sensed the truth, even if he never wanted to admit it. Claire finally revealed that Olivia had been involved with someone else for nearly a year, and the words hit Ethan with a sharp silence that seemed to swallow all other sounds in the room. He stared at the floor, trying to steady himself as memories of missed calls, late nights, and unexplained absences suddenly made more sense in a painful way. Claire looked regretful as she spoke further, explaining that she had known for some time but had stayed silent because Olivia had asked her to keep it secret. Ethan felt a strange mix of anger and emptiness, not only toward Olivia, but toward the situation that had slowly unfolded behind his back without his awareness. He asked Claire why she was telling him this now, and her answer was not simple because she admitted she had carried guilt for staying quiet and watching him struggle without understanding why. She said she had come because she could no longer watch him live in confusion, and because she believed he deserved the truth even if it broke something inside him. Ethan looked at her more closely, then noticing for the first time that her calm exterior hid a sadness that mirrored his own in a strange way. Claire walked slowly toward one of his framed photographs and studied it carefully, saying that Ethan had always seen people clearly in a way most did not, and that made it harder to lie to him. Her words carried an unexpected emotional weight, and Ethan felt something shift, not just about Olivia but about Claire too, because she no longer seemed like just a strict, distant figure in his life but a woman carrying her own hidden burdens. The conversation grew quieter as both of them stood in the same space, feeling the heaviness of truth settling around them like dust that could not be brushed away easily. Claire eventually stepped back as if realizing she had said too much, and Ethan could see hesitation in her eyes that went beyond guilt. She told him softly that she should leave, and as she reached the door she paused for a moment as if she wanted to say something else but could not find the right words. Ethan watched her go, feeling like something important had shifted in a way he could not fully understand yet. When she finally left the studio, the room felt emptier than before, and Ethan remained standing there alone, staring at the old photograph on his desk, realizing that nothing in his life would feel the same after this moment, because the truth had arrived not as a single shock but as the beginning of something he would have to rebuild from the ground up. Ethan stayed silent long after Claire left the studio, the rain outside growing heavier as if the weather itself was reacting to what he had just heard. He kept staring at the old photograph on his desk, trying to understand why something so simple could feel so heavy. The studio lights felt colder now, and every corner of the room seemed quieter than before. His mind kept replaying Claire's words about Olivia and the year of secrets that had been hidden from him. Part of him wanted to reject everything and believe there had to be some mistake, but another part of him already knew the truth had been waiting for him for a long time. He sat back down slowly and rubbed his face, trying to calm the storm inside his thoughts, but nothing settled. The silence of the studio made him feel even more alone than before. Hours passed without him realizing it until the light outside began to fade and the world turned gray. He finally stood up and began cleaning the studio without thinking, because movement felt easier than thinking. But every object he touched reminded him of something he had lost without knowing it. Later that night he closed the studio early and drove through the wet streets of Portland, Oregon, feeling like he was inside a life that no longer belonged to him. When he reached home, Olivia was already there, sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone like nothing had changed. Ethan stood in the doorway watching her for a moment, realizing how far apart they had become even while living under the same roof. She looked up and gave him a quick, tired glance before going back to her screen, and that small moment told him more than any conversation could. He walked inside slowly and sat across from her without speaking for a long time. Olivia finally noticed his silence and asked what was wrong, but her tone lacked concern and carried more impatience than care. Ethan looked at her carefully, searching for any sign of guilt or fear, but she simply waited for him to answer like she was expecting another normal complaint. He asked her directly if she was seeing someone else, and the question changed the air instantly. Olivia froze for a second but then sighed, like she had been waiting for this moment to come. She did not deny it. Instead, she looked away and said she was tired of pretending everything was fine. Her words were calm but distant, as if she had already emotionally left the marriage long ago. Ethan felt a sharp pain but also a strange calm, because hearing the truth was somehow easier than living in confusion. He asked how long it had been, and she admitted it had started quietly during a time when they were already drifting apart. She did not give excuses but also did not show much regret, which made the silence between them even heavier. Ethan realized that the version of Olivia he had been holding on to in his mind no longer existed in front of him. She was already living a different emotional life somewhere else, and he had been the last to notice. He stood up from the couch and walked to the window, looking at the dark street outside, trying to process how something so important had ended without a clear moment of breaking. Olivia finally asked if he was going to leave or stay, but her voice sounded more practical than emotional, as if she was discussing logistics instead of a marriage. Ethan did not answer right away because he did not know what staying meant anymore. Everything felt like it had already ended, even if they were still sitting in the same house. Later that night he went back to the studio alone because it was the only place that still felt like his own space. He sat in the dark room and thought about Claire's visit again and the way she had looked at him with sadness and hesitation. He started to realize that her presence was not just about revealing Olivia's truth but also about something deeper that neither of them had fully spoken about. Claire had not looked at him like a stranger during their conversation. There had been moments where her eyes lingered too long, as if she was seeing something beyond the situation itself. Ethan tried to ignore that thought, but it kept returning quietly in the background of everything else he was processing. He replayed her voice, her pauses, the way she had struggled to finish certain sentences, and slowly he began to understand that Claire had not just come as a messenger of truth but as someone carrying her own emotional weight. The realization unsettled him because it blurred the lines between sympathy and something else he was not ready to name. He told himself it was only shock and emotional confusion, but even then he could not ignore how deeply her words had affected him in a way that went beyond this situation with Olivia. The next day passed slowly as Ethan tried to continue work, but every client interaction felt distant and mechanical. He found himself thinking about Claire more than he wanted to admit. Not in a way that made sense but in fragments, like her expression when she admitted guilt or the softness in her voice when she spoke about honesty. He hated how often those details came back into his mind. By evening he closed the studio early again and walked through the quiet streets trying to clear his head, but instead of clarity he only felt more confusion about everything that had happened in the last 24 hours, somewhere between loss and truth and unexpected emotional connection. He understood that his life had already shifted in ways he could not reverse, and that the hardest part was not just the betrayal he had learned about but the strange emotional echoes that came with it, especially the memory of Claire's presence which lingered in his thoughts longer than he felt comfortable admitting. Ethan did not sleep properly after everything started collapsing around him. His mind kept replaying the conversation with Olivia and the strange emotional weight he had felt during Claire's visit. He tried to convince himself that the chapter was over now, that the truth was out, but closure did not come as easily as he expected. Instead, everything felt unfinished and suspended like a photograph that was never fully developed. The next morning he went to the studio earlier than usual just to avoid sitting in silence at home. The familiar smell of paper, ink, and camera equipment gave him a small sense of stability, but even that comfort felt weaker than before. As he adjusted lights and checked his camera settings, he kept remembering Claire's expression when she left the studio, not just what she said but how she said it, as if she had been carrying something far heavier than just guilt about Olivia. Days passed and Ethan slowly tried to rebuild his routine. He focused on clients, edited photos, and forced himself to respond with polite smiles, but something inside him remained unsettled. Every quiet moment brought Claire's voice back into his thoughts in ways he did not fully understand. He told himself it was only because she had delivered painful truth, but deep down he knew there was something else lingering beneath that explanation. A week later Olivia moved out without drama, no shouting, no final argument. Just boxes packed quietly and a short conversation about logistics. Ethan did not try to stop her because he had nothing left to argue for. Watching her leave felt less like heartbreak and more like watching something already gone finally disappear in physical form. After she left, the house felt strangely empty but also lighter in a way he could not explain. Still, that emptiness did not bring peace. Instead, it made room for thoughts he had been avoiding, especially thoughts about Claire. He kept telling himself to focus on his life, to rebuild, to move forward, but his mind kept drifting back to that rainy afternoon in the studio, to the way she had looked at him not just as Olivia's husband but as someone she seemed to truly see. One evening while closing the studio late, he found himself standing near the same desk where she had placed the old photograph. He picked it up again without thinking and stared at it longer this time, noticing details he had ignored before: the worn edges, the careful handwriting, the emotion hidden behind something that looked simple. It made him wonder how long Claire had carried that memory with her before finally deciding to bring it to him. A few days later he was organizing old client records when he found an envelope left unintentionally in a folder. Inside was a short handwritten note with Claire's name on it. No explanation, just a simple line saying she hoped he would find peace in time. Ethan sat with that note for a long time, because it felt personal in a way that confused him. It was not romantic in words, but it carried emotional weight that he could not ignore. It felt like someone reaching out without asking for anything in return. That night he walked through the city streets alone, trying to understand why this connection lingered in his thoughts more than the betrayal itself. He knew logically that Claire was his mother-in-law and that boundaries existed that could not be crossed, but emotionally his mind kept Returning to moments of understanding they had shared, the way silence between them had felt different, not empty but heavy with unspoken feelings. He hated himself for thinking about it too much, yet he could not stop. Weeks turned into months and life slowly stabilized again, work improved, clients returned, and the studio regained its rhythm, but internally Ethan felt changed. He was more observant of people now, more aware of hidden emotions behind polite conversations. Sometimes he caught himself wondering how many people lived with truths they never shared. One evening Claire called him unexpectedly, her voice calm but careful. She asked if he was doing all right, and the conversation stayed simple at first, about life, about work, about moving forward, but beneath the surface there was something unspoken between them that neither of them addressed directly. After a pause she thanked him again for listening to her that day and for not reacting with anger. Ethan admitted he did not know if silence was better than anger, but it had been what he could manage at the time. There was a moment of quiet on the phone that felt heavier than words. Then Claire softly said she hoped he understood that everything she did came from a place of honesty and difficulty. Ethan said he understood even though he was still processing it all. After the call ended he stood in the studio holding the phone for a long time, thinking about how life had shifted through small unexpected moments rather than big dramatic events. There was no clear resolution between him and Claire, no confession of anything beyond what had already happened, but there was something undeniable in the emotional imprint she had left behind. Not betrayal, not romance in action, but a complicated human connection formed through truth, timing, and loneliness. Ethan realized that some encounters in life do not fit into simple categories. They do not become love or friendship or conflict. They remain somewhere in between, shaping you quietly without asking permission. And as he turned off the studio lights that night he understood that his life had not only changed because of Olivia's betrayal, but also because of the unexpected emotional reflection that came from the one person he never expected to understand him in the first place.